The 24 Hours of Le Mans is the oldest active endurance race in the world, and it has become legendary. Since 1923, drivers of all stripes have arrived at the Circuit de la Sarthe to test their mettle and to fight to become one of the greatest drivers in the world. But not every moment in the race's history has been worthy of celebration. And today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're going to delve into the aftermath of the crash that almost killed racing as we know it today, the 1955 Le Mans disaster. Most motorsport fans today are aware of this horrifying crash, and they also likely know the broad strokes of what transpired in its aftermath, that events were canceled, that racing was banned in certain countries, that legends of motorsport like Mercedes entirely withdrew from racing for decades. Today, I want to contextualize both the crash and its aftermath in order to truly illustrate the gravity of motorsport's deadliest crash. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Pierre Levegh wanted to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans more than he wanted anything else in his life. When Levegh made his debut at the Circuit de la Sarthe in 1938, he was nearly 40 years old and chasing a dream that had very little basis in reality. When the track closed down in 1940 as a result of the conflict surrounding World War II, Levegh, described by author Robert Daley as a strong, phlegmatic little man who was known as the Bishop among his few friends, must have watched in horror as first the Germans seized the track and then the British pelted it with bombs. The future of the race seemed in immense doubt. There may not be any racetrack left at the end of the conflict. Thankfully, when the war ended, the organizers of the race revitalized the track and brought it back to racing condition for the 1949 running of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. That being said, the revitalization came with a serious amount of national pride. The race itself was effectively a metaphor for the French spirit, and that spirit absolutely refused to be crushed, whether by Germany and its invasion or by the economic hardships that racked France in the aftermath of the war. So it was especially important when in 1952, Pierre Levegh very nearly made history. He purchased a Talbot straight from the factory for a whopping $10,000 and then spent the next 6 months dedicated to outfitting it for the 24-hour race. He poured another $5,000 and countless man-hours into the car to transform it into a machine capable of winning a race whose prize money would never even come close to recouping the costs he'd spent in order to build that car in the first place. Levegh designed and built a lighter aluminum body that weighed under 37 pounds. He enlarged the gas tank to reduce any necessary stops, and he added the second ignition in case the first failed, among so much more. When he finished, Levegh felt that he had a car that could hold its own against the factory-backed might of Ferrari, Jaguar, Mercedes, and Aston Martin. Levegh was the driver who started that race. He ran across the track and leapt into his Talbot at the start, and for the next 2 revolutions of the clock, that is pretty much where he remained. Attrition slowly began to whittle down the field, and by 3 a.m., the dedicated Levegh had sailed into the lead of the race in his hand-modified machine. Just before dawn, he had a 32-mile lead over the factory outfits. He carved a path through the treacherous dawn mist, fighting fatigue, because the moment victory became a very real possibility, Pierre Levegh refused to climb from behind the wheel. But according to Robert Daley in his book Cars at Speed, that heroic morning effort had sapped Levegh of his strength, but not his insistence that he could fight for victory. His face had been drained of its color. In days, the pleas of Levegh's mechanics and co-driver fell on his unhearing ears. But the French audience at the track reveled in what was happening. Levegh's feat was almost legendary. Almost only because he had still to cross the finish line. As Daley writes, All through the town of Le Mans, the word spread. Levegh was going it alone. He led. He was holding back the German horde. There was symbolism there. There was glory in the making. Nearly en masse, the city trooped out to the circuit to watch Levegh wrestle with his car, his fatigue, and his dream. Whether Daley is exaggerating the size of the crowd or not is kind of beside the point. The folks who watched Levegh's efforts knew that they were witnessing something special. The 47-year-old Frenchman, not a racer, not professionally at least, was determined to win this race. The hours ticked by and his lap time slowed, but Levegh clutched the lead with intense determination. He ignored stomach cramps and the exhaustion that tempted him to close his eyes, if only for a few moments. He proceeded. And then, with just under 50 minutes to go, Levegh slowed to a stop on the course. Robert Daley and most other pundits at the time actually assumed that it was Levegh's fatigue that had caused him to shift up instead of down, and that it was his fatigue that broke his engine. More generous readings of history say that Levegh's failure was the result of a bolt in the central crankshaft bearing that had, under the protracted strain of the race, finally shaken loose. But whatever the reasoning, Levegh had failed. Robert Daley writes, "The crowd watched in angry silence. It felt cheated by Levegh. It had been ready to cheer itself hoarse for him, but he had not won. Instead, by his selfishness and stupidity, he had lost a certain victory for France, leaving the crowd to assist at still another victory for the hated Germans. So the crowd's attitude, and that of all of France, changed in a few moments. Levegh should have handed the car to a co-driver. He had not. So he won no glory at all, only shame." As far as Levegh himself went, it's said that when he finally climbed out of his broken car, he vomited uncontrollably, then wept in his wife's arms. In the aftermath, the Automobile Club of France made it strictly illegal for any one driver to race longer than 14 hours during the 24 hours of Le Mans. In 1953, Pierre Levegh was back, and he finished the race, but he was far from a podium position. The following year, he crashed. Then in 1955, Pierre Levegh was invited to join the iconic Mercedes race team alongside American driver John Fitch. Levegh must have been desperate. This would be his best shot at victory, and maybe his last, and he had so much to prove. But Levegh wasn't the only one who had his hopes riding high on the 1955 running of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. In the build-up to the race, the motorsport community had been devastated by several high-profile racing deaths. It's very easy to imagine that many fans probably hoped that the endurance race could revive the magic of motorsport in their minds. Part of what I like to do here at Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys is to contextualize some of these big motorsport events, to understand exactly why they became so important, and to fully understand the reaction to the 1955 Le Mans disaster, we need to turn our calendars back a few weeks, and to turn our attention to the 1955 month of May in Indianapolis. On May 16th, American racer Manny Aiello died. The 33-year-old driver from Burbank, California, had crashed during time trials for the Indy 500 the day before. Aiello had been the last driver to attempt to qualify on May 15th, and he took to the track just before the day's end at 6 p.m. But when Aiello got to speed, he hit the concrete wall outside of the first turn at over 140 miles per hour while trying to set his qualifying speed. The car slid 518 feet down the wall. Aiello was rushed to the hospital, but ultimately succumbed to a basal skull fracture. Rescuers at the crash site noted that Aiello had not been wearing his seatbelt and that his pockets were stuffed full of wrenches. Then just 2 weeks later, the 39th Indy 500 faced another tragedy on lap 56. Iconic driver Bill Vukovich held a strong lead when he came across a nasty crash. Roger Ward, who was several laps down, had flipped twice and landed on his wheels, albeit facing the wrong way on the track. His competitor Al Keller turned inside of Ward to try to avoid him, then jerked sharply back onto the track in order to avoid touching the grass. On the track, he made contact with Johnny Boyd. Boyd's car smashed into Vukovic, who was trying to avoid the whole fiasco himself. Vukovic launched into the outside barrier, and the force of the impact shot his car outside of the track, where it crashed into several parked spectator cars. When the machine finally came to a rest after spinning and flipping, it burst into flames. Vukovic died at the scene. It was a particularly brutal blow for American open-wheel racing, which had already seen the deaths of 4 other drivers that year. Adding to the horror of the whole month was the fact that just a few days before the Indy 500, 2-time Formula One champion Alberto Ascari had also been killed. Ascari had paid a visit to Monza to watch his friend and fellow racer Eugenio Castellotti test a new Ferrari sports car, the 750 Monza. The two men were set to share that car for the upcoming 1,000 kilometers of Monza race. Though he hadn't intended to drive that day, Ascari wanted to get behind the wheel and try the machine for himself, and he was still in his street clothes when he did. After his third lap, the Ferrari 750 Monza skidded and it flipped onto its nose before somersaulting. Ascari was thrown from the car and died at the scene. There's still a lot of debate and myth about that crash, and we're going to delve into it in more detail later this year on Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. It goes without saying, though, that this added into a very difficult month of May and a very painful build-up to the 24 Hours of Le Mans. So, heading into Le Mans, the entire motorsport world was in mourning. It's highly likely that many race fans were hoping for a quiet 24-hour extravaganza, if only to rid themselves of the foul taste of death left in their mouths. And the race itself did seem promising. 87 cars had registered for the event, but only 70 showed up for practice, and only 60 of those qualified for a starting slot. Manufacturers like Aston Martin, Jaguar, and Ferrari were set to duke it out with a deeply competitive Mercedes-Benz, which was turning its eye to sports car racing after absolutely dominating Formula One. The Mercedes 300 SLR is still considered one of the finest racing machines to this day, thanks to its 300 brake horsepower 3-liter straight-8 engine and the introduction of a hand-operated air brake to ease the strain on the drum brakes. Perhaps most critically, team manager Alfred Neubauer had put together a deeply international team in order to ease any concerns that may have been raised about a German team only signing German drivers. The 3 Mercedes cars were driven by Juan Manuel Fangio and Sterling Moss, Carl Kling and Andre Simon, and Pierre Levegh and John Fitch. Allegedly, John Fitch and Pierre Levegh spoke in depth before the race, during which time Levegh told the American, "The track is too narrow for these fast cars. Each time I go by the pit, it is with a feeling of unease, a feeling of being hemmed in." Later, Levegh is said to have added, "I do not like sitting in the left of this racing car. It is difficult enough to see team signals with the pit straight as narrow as it is. A driver needs to feel comfortable. I do not feel comfortable in this car." Then, the night before the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the two men dined together to discuss their strategy. Levegh's dour mood lightened throughout the night, perhaps as his confidence in his ability to win with Mercedes-Benz grew. As they left the restaurant, Levegh's wife pulled John Fitch to the side to say, "Pierre is so happy at this chance." Meanwhile, Jaguar brought 3 Works D-type racers with a power output of 270 brake horsepower and a top speed of 170 miles per hour, while Ferrari arrived with its new 735 LM racer boasting 360 brake horsepower from its straight-6 engine. As practice got underway, the Ferraris proved to be extremely quick over a single lap, but the Mercedes-Benz machines were expected to have the upper hand in long runs thanks to their impressive reliability. At the start, Ferrari launched into the lead, courtesy of a quick jump by Eugenio Castellotti at the front of the field, while Mike Hawthorne and the Jaguar trailed in second. Juan Manuel Fangio had caught his pants leg on the gear shift when he climbed into his car for the Le Mans-style start, which resulted in an unusual delay for the Argentine. However, when Castellotti aired under braking, it let both Hawthorne and Fangio by. Just a few hours into this race, and it was shaping up to be fantastic. If you're looking for some incredible, authentic motorsport merch with a retro flair that looks unlike anything else you can see in the stores, make sure you check out Home Field Apparel. The company is based right in Speedway, Indiana, and it has developed a few exceptional racing-related lines this year that celebrate some of the greatest motorsport teams and events in American history. Make sure you stop by the link in my bio to check out the goods, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 to get 15% off your first purchase. At 6:26 p.m., as the leaders neared the end of the 35th lap of the race, motorsport's greatest disaster struck. Mike Hawthorne and Juan Manuel Fangio, at each other's throats, knew that the coming moments of the race would be critical ones because pit stops were about to begin. On lap 34, Hawthorne's crew had signaled for him to stop the next time by, and the British ace responded by lapping some of the slower cars, desperate to put as many machines between himself and Fangio as possible. He lapped Levegh at Arnage, and he began trying to lap Lance Macklin and an Austin Healey after Maison Blanche. Things disintegrated. As Hawthorne approached the main straight after passing Macklin, he raised his hand to signal that he was about to dart to the right in order to reach the pit lane. To slow in time for the pits, Hawthorne braked hard. When Hawthorne swerved, Macklin also swerved to take evasive action, perhaps because he didn't see Hawthorne's hand signal, or perhaps because he was caught out by the Jaguar's ability to come to a sharp stop. Perhaps his car's brakes had even worn unevenly and forced him a little to the side. But as Lance Macklin drifted back onto the track, he also drifted into the path of Pierre Levegh. There was no time to stop. Levegh's Mercedes was speeding at over 120 miles per hour, and there was no time for him to react, and there was nowhere for him to go. His right front wheel rode up the back of Macklin's car and turned the Mercedes into an airborne missile aimed directly at a crowd of spectators. Levegh was thrown from his car as it careened toward the spectators. When he landed, the impact crushed his skull and killed him instantly. His Mercedes, though, had not stopped. The car rolled end over end for over 250 feet before it crashed into an earthen embankment that separated the spectators from the track and finally came to a rest by smashing against a concrete stairwell. The machinery completely disintegrated. The engine block, radiator, and front suspension shot through over 300 feet of packed spectators while the hood scythed through the crowd. The horror, though, was not through. Levegh's rear-mounted fuel tank had exploded on impact with the embankment. The Mercedes had been designed with speed in mind, meaning that much of its bodywork was made of a magnesium alloy with a low ignition point. The skeleton of the car burst into ultra-hot flames, spitting embers into the crowd. Jaguar driver Duncan Hamilton watched the horror unfold from the pit wall. Asked about the disaster later in his life, he said, "The scene on the other side of the road was indescribable. The dead and dying were everywhere. The cries of pain, anguish, and despair screamed catastrophe. I stood as if in a dream, too horrified to even think." In that moment, there was no way to know the full extent of the damage that had been done, but onlookers like Duncan Hamilton could tell that something truly unspeakable had just taken place, and that the racing world would have much to reckon with. Lance Macklin's Austin Healey came to a rest in the pit lane, narrowly missing the cars and crews that had already assembled for the first stops of the race. A policeman, a photographer, and 2 officials were struck by the machine and suffered serious, albeit non-fatal injuries. The Austin Healey spun across the track and finally came to rest after dragging down a fence on the left side of the racetrack. Macklin was able to jump from the car without any major injuries. Meanwhile, Mike Hawthorne had overshot his pit box. He climbed out of the car, dazed, only to find that his Jaguar team ordered him to get back behind the wheel and take another lap of the Circuit de la Sarthe as the chaos died down. After making that revolution, some of the initial shock must have worn off because Hawthorne returned to the pit box in despair, under the firm belief that his sudden jaunt into the pits had caused this accident. Unable to comfort him, his rookie teammate Ivor Boub was forced to make his first laps at the 24 Hours of Le Mans as the calamity continued. In the Mercedes pits, Levegh's wife Denise Bouillon and his co-driver John Fitch stood at the ready for an impending pit stop when the disaster took place. Fitch was ready to take over driving duties, and Bouillon was ready to welcome her husband back to safety. The two had a prime view of both the accident and of Levegh's lifeless body being slowly consumed in flame until a police officer finally covered the corpse with a banner. Fitch remained with Bouillon for half an hour before he finally headed to the media center to phone his family and inform them that he wasn't the one involved in the wreck. When he arrived, he overheard a journalist reporting that 48 deaths had already been confirmed. When he returned to the Mercedes pit box, Fitch immediately pulled team boss Alfred Neubauer to the side to suggest that the team withdraw entirely from the race. Whether a Mercedes won or lost, the German marque was sure to face a hefty backlash. The wounds of World War II still festered, and there would be no way to delicately state that a German team had caused dozens of French deaths on French soil once again. Neubauer didn't have the authority to make the call. It was just before midnight when he finally received a call from the company's directors, who had staged an emergency meeting and finally agreed to withdraw the team. Neubauer waited again until 1:45 a.m., when many spectators had cleared out of the stands, to finally call in his final two cars, which were running first and third. By morning, Mercedes had entirely packed up its outfit and cleared out of the track, but not before asking Jaguar team manager Lofty England if he'd consider withdrawing his own cars as well, out of respect. Jaguar chose to remain in the race. All the while, gendarmes, medics, and other spectators in the area attended to the injured and dead in a scene that must have looked eerily similar to the aftermath of a battlefield. According to a post-race report from The Guardian, 2 young boys had been decapitated. The father of one of the boys succumbed to his injuries soon after. A mother clutched her son's mutilated body to her, shocked. A man named Jacques Lalonde, who had suffered injuries to his head, told the Guardian reporter that, quote, "There was a terrific explosion and 2 car wheels whistled over my head. I saw a little girl in a light-colored dress who had been trampled on by panic-stricken spectators lying in a pool of blood. A piece of metal hit me square in the forehead, and I saw a headless man beside me collapse like a rag doll. Pleas for the donation of blood went unheard. The spectators around the track had no idea what had just happened." Meanwhile, Pierre Levegh's car still smoldered next to the Circuit de la Sarthe. The firemen available had never quelled a magnesium fire before, and quickly learned that trying to douse the blaze in water would only make things worse. They left the chassis amid the rest of the carnage, waiting for it to burn out. Controversially, many spectators at other parts of the Circuit de la Sarthe had no idea that anything had transpired. Race director Charles Theroux declined to red flag the event. He cited several controversial reasons for his decision. First and foremost, ending the race would result in angry spectators leaving the track and clogging up the quiet country roads around Le Mans. Those routes needed to stay open in order to facilitate the quick transfer of injured parties to the hospital. Theroux's other decisions were a little less sound. He stated that he didn't have the authority to stop the race. That decision would have to come from Prefect Pierre Thuy, the on-site representative to the Ministry of the Interior. Theroux stated that the teams could also sue him for not completing the race. He also reasoned that, quote, "The rough law of sport dictates that the race shall go on." And so on it went. Many fans likely first discovered something truly horrifying had happened only when at-track announcers declared that Mercedes had withdrawn from the event. As for the race itself, it was a show dominated by Jaguar. Mike Hawthorne and Ivar Bueb won the race, but their celebrations were muted by tragedy. One photo emerged of Hawthorne sipping from a bottle of champagne on the podium that the French press instantly latched onto. Motorsport magazine L'Auto Journal posted the photo with the caption, "A votre santé, Monsieur Hawthorne," or, effectively, a very sarcastic, "Cheers, Mr. Hawthorne." News of the 1955 Le Mans disaster spread quickly in the week after the event. Papers in the United States and United Kingdom had already begun to report on the death of countless spectators before June 11th had even come to a close, drowning out hopeful reports of a Mercedes-Jaguar duel or features on local entrants hoping to make history. In the United States, reports of the rising death toll often came alongside mentions of Bill Vukovic's tragic death. The number of dead spectators slowly began to rise before settling somewhere between 80 to 84 fatalities. An additional 120 had been injured. Reports around the world scrambled to find their most qualified historians and statisticians, who all agreed that they had seen nothing like this before. On Monday, June 13th, the French cabinet met to hear reports on the tragedy with the intention of launching a legal investigation and to rework a 20-year-old decree governing track safety measures. It was announced that a mass funeral for the deceased spectators was planned in the Gothic cathedral crowning the village of Le Mans, scheduled for the following day. The response to the tragedy varied from country to country. In England, journalists excoriated the race organizers for refusing to put a stop to the event, with the London Daily Telegraph stating that continuing to race and the specter of disaster, quote, "expose the sporting spirit to the charge of callousness." It argued that the race should have been red flagged immediately. Over in France, reporters wondered why Jaguar had refused to withdraw from the race alongside Mercedes. On June 14th, 1955, just 3 days after the disaster, France banned all automobile road racing. It was intended to be a temporary measure, at least until the country could better understand what had gone wrong and how to enact meaningful changes. Members of the French cabinet agreed that contemporary racing regulations simply were not sufficient to protect both drivers and spectators. The ultimate argument about the track was one that we've seen time and again in racing. The circuit facilities were simply outdated and could not cope with the ever-increasing speeds of the race cars. Cars hitting the barrier at old speeds used to overturn. Now they fly into the air over the barriers, Monsieur Paul Gobert, deputy prefect of the area, said. However, the goal was not to completely ban motorsport for the remainder of time. Gobert continued, "Le Mans will do anything to see that the 24-hour race continues, even if it means spending large amounts to improve the track." Initial ideas involved eliminating different classes of cars, reducing the number of cars that could start, widening the track, and further separating spectators from potential crash sites. That same day, Mercedes-Benz told the FIA that it would formally withdraw from racing at the end of the 1955 season. While it initially stated that its withdrawal would only last until greater safety standards were implemented, the iconic German marque wouldn't reappear again on the international scene until 1989. This largely came down to the fact that Mercedes had already decided that 1955 would be its final year in motorsport. The Le Mans disaster simply meant its withdrawal came several months earlier than intended. By the end of that first week after the crash, the Royal Automobile Club of Britain had committed itself to launching a deeper investigation into the safety of motorsport in its own country. Lance Macklin made headlines by claiming that high speeds caused a horrifying crash. Mike Hawthorne appeared on television to decry the narrow width of the track. Organizers of the Spanish Grand Prix canceled a race that was planned for October. Within the first month of the disaster, the Italian Automobile Club issued a temporary ban on all racing activity within the country. The Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort carried on as planned, though many reporters claimed they felt uneasy examining the track conditions. On June 21st, Mercedes cut a 1,000-pound check to the families of the victims of the crash as experts continued poring over footage of the accident. By June 22nd, the Swiss, Spanish, and French Grand Prix were canceled. Switzerland would not lift its ban on motor racing for several decades after. The British Grand Prix was announced to proceed as scheduled. The iconic International Alpine Rally was canceled, followed by the 1,000 kilometers of Nürburgring in Germany and the Carrera Panamericana in Mexico. Heinz Nordhoff of Volkswagen stated that motorsport was no longer integral to the development of the automobile, and that the goals of motorsport were, quote, more than questionable. Road safety activists used the Le Mans tragedy to illustrate their claims that even public roads were dangerous. On July 11th, Margaret Pritchard was killed during an all-female exhibition race in California. It spurred plenty of reflection on what many were calling the bloodiest 6 months in motorsport history, where death took no vacation. 91 people had been killed in racing accidents between January 1st and June 30th, and the very fate of motorsport as a whole seemed threatened. Racing across the globe was canceled. Investigators couldn't find anything specific to blame for the Le Mans tragedy, which meant no one knew how to prevent a similar event in the future. Yes, motorsport had survived countless horrors in the past, but this one felt different. It felt intense, preventable, and horrifying all at the same time. And because it wasn't the only notable accident in 1955, it felt especially grim. Could racing ever continue in an era of rapid technological innovation, rising speeds, and gruesome horrors? Only time would be able to tell. At the end of 1955, the American Automobile Association, or AAA, announced that it would no longer sanction motorsport, and it disbanded its contest board. While the AAA wasn't the only sanctioning body in the United States at the time, it was certainly one of the largest and most influential. As we've talked about in previous episodes of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, the AAA was responsible for organizing the Indianapolis 500, and it also served as the primary liaison to the FIA and other international racing organizations. With news of its withdrawal, American motorsport scrambled to fill the void. In Europe, many countries slowly lifted their bans on racing before the year was out. France was especially keen to revive its racing scene as a way to start moving forward from the tragedy. On September 14, 1955, the French government released a new set of racing regulations that circuits and event organizers would need to follow in order to be granted permission to compete. Among the requirements were a minimum track width of 24 feet, with the pit lanes set about 16 feet back from the track itself. Dangerous bends or kinks in the road would have to be eliminated, while thick protective walls needed to be erected in front of spectator areas. Those walls also needed to be reinforced by an earthen embankment. The whole goal was to push spectators further back from any danger and to make sure that the growing cars would have space to race on the track. The investigation into the Le Mans disaster continued. Drivers, team personnel, officials, designers, and more all had a chance to testify in front of the French government, sharing information about everything from car construction to the horrors that they had witnessed as spectators at Le Mans. Engineers tested the wrecked vehicles and only returned the charred remains of Pierre Levegh's Mercedes-Benz to the factory after about a year had passed. As the discovery process continued and its details leaked to the press, the media lit up with speculation. Understandably, everyone wanted answers, and they also wanted someone to blame. Mike Hawthorne ultimately shouldered the bulk of the accusations. Both Mercedes-Benz and Lance Macklin had testified that Hawthorne's sharp swerve into the pit lane and his dramatic braking had essentially been to blame for the whole affair, and reporters really latched onto those accounts in light of there being nothing else to go on. Mercedes maintained it should not be considered at fault. After all, its car never would have scythed through a crowd or burst into flame if Hawthorne hadn't forced it off the track. But if you ask Jaguar, Hawthorne should have faced no blame. In fact, the British mark questioned why Lance Macklin and Pierre Levegh had even been allowed to drive high-speed race cars in the first place. Here, the sentiment was largely that Levegh was an old and poor driver, and that Macklin was running a slow car that should have been nowhere close to the frontrunners. Again, there were no instant replays or social media clips to analyze, so many fans who wanted someone to blame simply picked the stories from the press that they liked best. Making things worse was the fact that many of the initial accounts of the wreck were either completely false, based on hearsay, or totally exaggerated. Many of the reporters tasked to write about the crash had not been at Le Mans and relied on first-hand accounts of teams, drivers, and fans, many of whom likely had an agenda or who were deeply traumatized by what they had witnessed. And some of the stories got very wild. Some media reports claimed that Mercedes had added illegal components to its fuel, which was why the fire had been impossible to extinguish. It required additional testing of the remaining fuel on the wrecked car's fuel injection line in order to clear up that accusation. In an era where teams pushed the boundaries of car construction, it simply made more sense to bystanders that the fuel would be the problem. The combustibility of the car's magnesium alloy chassis was simply not a consideration. Much to the disappointment of the people who wanted someone to blame, the French government ultimately concluded that the 1955 Le Mans disaster was simply a horrifying racing accident that resulted from a combination of factors that were no single person's fault. Instead, investigators said the track's safety standards were simply not capable of protecting bystanders as cars continued to increase in speed. After all, the drivers had been raising concerns about the track construction for several years, and most of those concerns centered around the fact that the pit straight was narrow and featured no clear demarcation between the racing surface and the pit boxes. Further changes were made both to the Circuit de la Sarthe and to other tracks around the world in light of the investigation's findings. But the drama was not through. Understandably, both Mike Hawthorne and Lance Macklin were deeply affected by the crash, and they carried that with them for the rest of their lives. In 1958, though, Macklin picked up a copy of Hawthorne's autobiography titled Challenge Me the Race, only to find that Hawthorne's recollections of the horrifying crash differed from his own. And it also didn't feature any culpability. See, in the book, Hawthorne doesn't identify the cause of the crash, and he doesn't really dwell on the crash at all for very long. But Macklin believed that Hawthorne should shoulder some responsibility in public for his role in the crash. Yes, it was a shocking tragedy, but it did technically stem from Hawthorne's sudden swerve into the pit lane and his sudden braking. By not admitting that, though, Macklin felt Hawthorne was shifting the blame onto his shoulders, implying that the crash actually stemmed from Macklin's evasive maneuver in response to Hawthorne. Macklin was so incensed by what he felt was an unfair accusation against him that he began a libel lawsuit. The case was dropped in 1958 after Hawthorne was killed passing a road-going Mercedes-Benz in his personal Jaguar. It isn't really clear what Macklin intended to achieve with the lawsuit, since it didn't really hold much water and likely wouldn't have resulted in any satisfying conclusion. David Greenhall, a professional lawyer, speculated that at most, the trial would have gone to a hearing and Hawthorne would have been subjected to a painful cross-examination process. However, there was no real evidence that would have supported either driver's assertion that he wasn't at fault and that the other party was definitively at fault. It was a surprising twist for Macklin because the drivers had generally avoided attacking one another when they were being interviewed throughout the investigation. However, Macklin also later claimed that the investigation was a farce. Understandably, it was a wound that would have been immensely difficult to heal, and it's an event that still encourages a massive amount of debate today. It is almost remarkable that motorsport as a whole wasn't killed in the aftermath of the 1955 Le Mans disaster. But racing did continue, albeit under a heavy cloud of controversy that took years to clear up. Just to really highlight the impact this event had, I want to project into the future. Let's take a glance at the world of motorsport as it was impacted by the 1955 Le Mans disaster. While the 24 hours of Le Mans continued on in the wake of the crash, the track was immediately modified. The entire pit lane was renovated so that there was a bigger barrier between the track and the grandstands, and the track overall was widened, which resulted in a shortening of the track by about 100 feet. New signaling areas were installed at the Mulsanne corner, where teams could hold out pit boards for their drivers at the slowest part of the track, while also avoiding any unnecessary distractions on the pit straight. However, many manufacturers and drivers understandably viewed the event with skepticism and caution. It took until the mid-1960s before public opinion really changed, in large part thanks to the fierce battles between Ford, Ferrari, and Porsche. As speeds rose in the 1960s, the track was altered to include the Ford chicane, followed by some seriously substantial changes. The Maison Blanche kink was bypassed entirely for 1972, and the Porsche curves were built instead. The Tertre Rouge corner was reprofiled in 1979, turning it into a complex double apex corner that resulted in the demolition of the second Dunlop Bridge. The Mulsanne corner was slowed a bit in 1986, and in 1990, the Hunaudière Straight saw the addition of 2 chicanes to meet the FIA's recent rules that limited maximum length of any one straight. That year also saw a new pit lane entry and new pit buildings to allow for more room for teams to work. Chicanes were added to the Mulsanne Straight in 2002, and in 2006 the Dunlop curve and chicane were reprofiled, all with the intention of adding more runoff area. Critically, these changes were made in anticipation of any serious accidents. The track organizers did not want another disaster on their hands. During that time, other dangerous, difficult races, like the Carrera Panamericana, the Targa Florio, and the Mille Miglia, were completely canceled thanks to their reliance on narrow public roads. After its withdrawal from motorsport at the end of 1955, Mercedes-Benz was hesitant to re-involve itself in the racing world. The team used tuning company AMG to compete in sports car events in the late 60s and early 1970s, then returned as an engine supplier for Sauber in 1985. 10 years later, Mercedes rejoined the Formula One world by supplying engines to McLaren, and it also built a CLK GTR in 1997 to actively compete in sports car racing again. The brand's slow reintroduction to motorsport only came at a time when post-World War II tensions had eased and the specter of the Le Mans disaster had faded. In the United States, after the AAA left racing, events like the Indianapolis 500 were sanctioned by a new organization, the United States Auto Club, or USAC. This sanctioning body was created by Indianapolis Motor Speedway owner Tony Hallman to promote open-wheel racing in America. It was ultimately a terrible move, both for the Indy 500 and for open-wheel racing in general in America. Decades of infighting followed as some teams and drivers resented the control Hallman and USAC had over the greatest event in American racing. Soon after, American open-wheel racing fractured in two, and that rift is still in the process of being healed today. In 2018, over 60 years after motorsport was initially banned, the first race took place in Switzerland. 3 years earlier, the Swiss government had relaxed its ban on all motorsport activity to allow electric cars to race in the country. Formula E was the first series to bring active competition back to Switzerland with its Zurich E-Prix, bringing an end to one of the longest lingering and immediate effects of the 1955 Le Mans disaster. Today, if you pay a visit to the Circuit de la Sarthe hunting for any lingering scars of the 1955 Le Mans disaster, you won't find many. The track has changed, and so has its atmosphere. But there is one single memorial, difficult to spot if you don't know what you're looking for. A simple black plaque was erected at the crash site in 1956 on the north wall of the pit straight, reading only In Memoriam, 11 June 1955. Sometimes, during competition, the plaque is covered. Allegedly, some particularly superstitious drivers prefer not to be reminded of motorsport's greatest tragedy on every lap they make around the track. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next show, we're ringing in America's Independence Day by delving into the 1977 Firecracker 400, which featured 3 female drivers and a whole lot of ill intentions. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, make sure to check out this DPTJ Patreon and subscribe. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts where I delve deeper into contemporary motorsport news, as well as newsletters that round up the biggest events, both past and present, that you should be paying attention to. Plus, if you want to send an email, there is an address for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Thank you so much to Patreon subscriber Ryan Lorman. Ryan, once again, the very first member of the World Champions Patreon tier, which means so much to me. Ryan, thank you for the wonderful ongoing support and for being the first DPTJ WDC. I also have to give a shout out to Nicole Washington. Nicole is the second person to join the World Champions tier on the DPTJ Patreon. Nicole, thank you so much for your support and welcome to the DPTJ family. I also want to read out a great comment I received from Auntie_Knowles. They wrote, "Fantastic. I've always loved all forms of motorsport, but have been lacking in more of the history aspects. Elizabeth Blackstock brings me the history of many things that I haven't really thought about before. Really looking forward to listening and learning more." Thank you so much for the kind words, and I hope you are learning lots. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel. The Indy 500 may be in the rearview mirror, but it is never too early to start prepping your wardrobe for next year. Make sure to check out the link in my bio to sign up for updates, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% of your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after that iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It is important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find the full list in the episode description. This week, I've referenced Cars at Speed by Robert Daley, which is one of my favorite motorsport books of all time. It's a fairly older book, now out of print, but it gives a great history of some of the greatest events in the motorsport world, like the Mille Miglia, the Targa Florio, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and even the French Grand Prix. I also referred to Le Mans 100, a century of the world's greatest endurance race by Glen Smale, as well as a variety of newspaper sources that are linked in the description below. Thank you all again for listening to another episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll see you next time.